Welcome back. We left off last time talking about the special angles in the first quadrant. We said that if we started with the x-axis as the initial and terminal side, then this would be 0 degrees here, and this would be 90 degrees here. And we came up with 3 special angles between 0 and 90. They were pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. And they corresponded to 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. Well, up here is pi over 2, if we recall. And we'll find that if we add pi over 2 to those 3 angles, pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3, we will get a reflection of those 3 angles in the second quadrant. A reflection about the y-axis. So, we just need to know a little bit of arithmetic with fractions, and we'll start with that pi over 6, the first 30-degree angle of our quadrant 1. So if we start in radians with pi over 6, and we add pi over 2 to that, all right, that is equivalent to pi over 6 plus, if we change this pi over 2 to sixths, right, that'll be 3 pi over 6, because 3 over 6 simplifies to 1 over 2. So this is equivalent, and now we can add, because we have the same denominators, we end up with 4 pi over 6, which is simplifies to 2 pi over 3. So that first angle in the second quadrant in the unit circle is 2 pi over 3, all right? And we'll do the same thing now with this next angle. We'll start with the reflection about the y. So we start with 45 degrees in the first quadrant, which is pi over 4. If we start with that and we add pi over 2 radians to that, that's the same thing as saying pi over 4 plus the equivalent in fourths of pi over 2 is 2 pi over 4. So if we add pi over 4 to 2 pi over 4, we get 3 pi over 4. And so this angle here is known in radians as 3 pi over 4. The other angle in the second quadrant that we want to look at is, we start with pi over 3 in the first quadrant. That's right here. Pi over 3. And we add again pi over 2 to that. Well, they don't have the same denominator, so we have to convert both this time. So if we convert them both into sixths, we have 2 pi over 6 plus 3 pi over 6. And now they have the same denominator. We end up with 5 pi over 6. And that will be located right here, 5 pi over 6. So now we see, because we know that this is in radians, over here is pi degrees, so pi radians, excuse me. Now we have the second quadrant reflections of the first quadrant reflected about the y-axis by adding pi over 2 radians to each initial angle measurement in the first quadrant. Likewise, you can add 90 degrees to 30 degrees to come up with 120 degrees. You can add 90 degrees to 45 degrees, and you can end up with 135 degrees. And you can add 90 degrees to 60 degrees to come up with 150 degrees. So those are equivalent. So 2 pi over 3 is equivalent to 120 degrees. 3 pi over 4 radians is equivalent to 135 degrees. 5 pi over 6 is equivalent to 150 degrees. And pi radians is equivalent to 180 degrees. Thank you for watching.